A woman stumbles through the Colorado blizzard, wrapped in rags, barely alive. When a rugged mountain man finds her, she whispers, trembling, "Please, don't take the cloth off." But when he brings her to his cabin, something about her silence and her fear doesn't add up. As the storm howls outside, secrets begin to stir within. Who is she hiding from? And what sin could make a woman beg to keep her face unseen? Soon, soldiers' hoofbeats thunder through the valley, hunting someone they call a traitor. The mountain man must choose: turn her in and stay safe, or protect her and risk everything. But when he finally lifts the cloth, he uncovers more than a face. He uncovers a lie buried in blood and gold. Now faith, mercy, and justice collide in the high wilderness, where one man's decency might be the only thing standing between grace and ruin. Will the truth set her free, or destroy them both before the storm clears? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The bitter wind howled through the Wind River Mountains, cutting through Adriel Grant's wool coat like icy daggers. He pulled his collar higher, scanning the snow-laden forest for signs of elk. Dark clouds roiled overhead, promising another storm before nightfall. His weathered face creased with concern. He needed meat stored before the worst of winter set in. The crunch of his boots in the deep snow echoed through the silent forest. At 38, Adriel knew these mountains better than he knew himself. Each tree, each rocky outcrop told him stories of the land's moods. Today, everything whispered of danger. The wind carried that sharp edge that meant a blizzard was brewing. He paused, adjusting the rifle slung across his back. The creek ahead gurgled faintly under its coating of ice, barely visible through the swirling snow. Something moved near the water's edge, too small for elk. Adriel narrowed his eyes, years of tracking making him wait, watch. The shape stumbled, distinctly human. His heart jumped as he saw it was a woman, wrapped in what looked like little more than rags, struggling through snow that reached past her knees. Her movements were slow, unsteady, the kind of slowness that meant death was near. "Lord Almighty," he muttered, the words foreign on his tongue after so many silent years. He broke into a run, powder snow flying as he rushed toward her. She didn't seem to hear his approach. When he reached her, she was swaying on her feet, her clothing crusted with ice. A cloth covered her face, frozen stiff from her breath. Her hands, raw and red from exposure, clutched weakly at the air as she started to fall. Adriel caught her before she hit the snow. She felt like ice through his gloves, her body rigid with cold. As he shifted to lift her properly, her hands suddenly found strength, clutching desperately at the cloth covering her face. "Please." Her voice was barely a whisper, cracked and dry. "Don't take the cloth off." "I won't," he promised, though his mind raced with questions. "I've got a line shack nearby. Hold on." She went limp in his arms, but her fingers remained tangled in the cloth. Adriel moved as quickly as he dared through the deepening snow, following his own tracks back toward the shelter. The wind picked up, driving ice crystals against his face like tiny needles. The line shack emerged from the whiteout, a solid structure of rough-hewn logs he'd built 5 years ago after leaving his homestead. It wasn't much, but it was warm and dry. He'd never been more grateful for its existence than now. Adriel shouldered the door open, ducking to enter the low doorway. The interior was cold, but still warmer than outside. He'd banked the morning's fire well. Coals still glowed beneath the ash. With one hand, he swept his sleeping pallet closer to the hearth, then gently laid the woman down. She didn't stir as he worked, her breathing shallow but steady. Adriel added wood to the fire, working quickly until flames licked upward. The woman's clothes were soaked through. She'd freeze to death in them, cloth or no cloth. "Ma'am," he said softly, touching her shoulder. "Your clothes are wet through. I've got dry things you can wrap in, but you need to change." No response. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge that scared him. Adriel ran a hand through his beard, thinking hard. There was no good choice here. She needed those wet clothes off, but he'd promised about the cloth. He dug through his trunk, pulling out a clean shirt and his spare wool blankets. Then he reached for the buffalo hide he used on the coldest nights. Working as carefully as he could, he managed to wrap the hide around her in a way that let him pull her wet clothes out from underneath while keeping her covered. He left the face cloth in place, though his fingers itched to know what secret lay beneath it. The storm hit full force as he worked, wind shrieking through the cabin's chinks. Adriel plugged the worst gaps with rags, then set water to heat on the small stove. The woman's breathing had steadied somewhat, but she still hadn't woken. He settled on his stool near the fire, watching her chest rise and fall beneath the buffalo hide. It had been years since he'd prayed, not since Sarah and their unborn child had been taken by cholera. The words felt rusty, uncertain. "Lord," he whispered, "if you're still listening to the likes of me, help her live through this night." The wind howled louder, as if in answer. Adriel added more wood to the fire, trying to remember the last time he'd spoken more than a few words to another person. Mostly he traded in silence, using hand signs with the Shoshone and simple nods with the few other trappers he encountered. The woman stirred slightly, a small sound escaping her. Adriel leaned forward, but she didn't wake. Her face remained hidden behind that frozen cloth, and he wondered what sin could drive someone to flee into a winter storm. He'd seen shame drive people before, had let his own grief drive him into these mountains. But this felt different. He put coffee on to boil, more for something to do than from any real desire to drink it. The familiar routine helped settle his thoughts. Whatever her story was, it could wait until she was stronger. For now, his job was simply to keep her alive. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Snow sifted through the smallest gaps in the cabin's walls, creating tiny drifts on the floor. Adriel moved around the small space, gathering supplies he might need. Clean rags, his medical kit, dried herbs he'd learned about from trading with the Shoshone. As darkness fell outside, the woman's breathing grew stronger. Some color returned to what little he could see of her skin. Adriel felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. She would likely live through the night, though morning might bring challenges of its own. He settled back on his stool, watching the fires dance across the rough walls. The woman's presence filled the cabin with an unfamiliar energy, something like hope, something like fear. It had been so long since he'd had to care for another person. The coffee pot began to bubble. Adriel poured himself a cup, letting the bitter warmth spread through his chest. Outside, the wind continued its mournful song through the pines. Inside, the fire popped and crackled, and two people's breath mingled in the warm air, one steady with sleep, one thoughtful and waiting. Whatever morning might bring, tonight was for healing. Adriel settled in for his vigil, his prayers continuing silently as the storm raged on. For the first time in years, his solitude felt like something other than punishment. Tonight, it felt like purpose. He found himself studying what little he could see of her, the curve of her shoulder under the buffalo hide, the way her fingers still clutched that mysterious cloth even in sleep. There was something both fragile and fierce about her, like a wounded bird that would still fight to fly. The night deepened. Adriel added wood to the fire whenever it started to die down, moving as quietly as he could. Each time he passed near her, he checked her breathing, relieved to find it growing stronger. Her skin felt warmer now when he touched her forehead above the cloth. He thought about the tracks he'd seen, or rather, hadn't seen, near where he'd found her. In weather like this, tracks filled quickly, but there should have been some sign of where she'd come from. It was as if she'd appeared from nowhere, like a spirit in the snow. The rational part of his mind knew there had to be an explanation. People didn't just materialize in the wilderness, but there was something about her that made him wonder. Something in the way she'd appeared just when the storm was building. Something in her desperate grip on that face cloth. Adriel shook his head, at his own fanciful thoughts. Years of mountain solitude must be affecting his mind. She was just a woman. Injured, running from something perhaps, but human all the same. Come morning, she'd wake and tell her story. Or she wouldn't. Either way, his job was simply to help her survive until then. He pulled his Bible from the shelf, a habit he'd all but abandoned these past years. The leather was cracked, the pages weathered from the times he'd read it in anger after Sarah's death, demanding answers that never came. Tonight he opened it gently, letting the familiar words wash over him without expectation. The storm continued its assault on the cabin. But inside, peace slowly settled. The woman's breathing matched the rhythm of the fire's crackle. Adriel read by the wavering light, his lips moving silently over psalms he'd once known by heart. Gradually, the words began to feel less like strangers. Hours passed this way, Adriel moving between watching his unexpected guest, tending the fire, and reading. Sometimes he dozed lightly on his stool, waking at the slightest change in the woman's breathing. The night seemed to stretch endlessly, filled with the wind's howl and the fire's warm light. As the darkness began to soften toward dawn, Adriel found himself wondering what Sarah would think of all this. She'd always been the one with the bigger heart, the one who took in strays and nursed them back to health. He'd learned his healing skills from her, watching her tend to injured animals and sick neighbors alike. The thought didn't bring the usual sharp pain. Instead, he felt something like her presence, approving of his actions. Maybe this was what prayer felt like when it wasn't born of anger. This quiet sense of guidance, of doing what needed to be done. The woman shifted in her sleep, making a small sound of discomfort. Adriel moved to check on her, adjusting the buffalo hide where it had slipped. Her fingers were still tangled in the face cloth, but their grip had relaxed slightly. Her breathing was strong and steady now, her skin warm to the touch. He added more wood to the fire and settled back on his stool. Morning would come soon enough, bringing with it whatever story she carried. For now he was content to wait, to watch, to wonder what kind of grace had led their paths to cross in the wilderness. The storm was beginning to ease, its fury spent. Soon, dawn would break over a transformed landscape, everything made new by snow. Adriel felt transformed himself, as if the simple act of helping another had awakened something long dormant in his soul. He watched the woman sleep, this stranger whose presence had filled his silent cabin with something like hope. Whatever sin she was running from, whatever secret lay beneath that cloth, he would help her. It felt right, like something he'd been waiting to do without knowing it. The fire crackled softly, sending shadows dancing across the cabin's walls. Outside, the wind's howl softened to a whisper. Inside, two souls waited for morning, one sleeping, one watching, both somehow less alone than they had been when the storm began. Morning crept into the cabin like a hesitant visitor, gray light seeping through the frost-covered window. Adriel stirred from his vigil, muscles stiff from the long night on the wooden stool. The fire had burned low, leaving the air sharp with winter's bite. He added fresh logs, watching as tiny sparks danced upward through the chimney. The woman, his mysterious guest, lay still beneath the buffalo hides, but something in her breathing told him she was awake. He moved quietly to the crude shelf where he kept his coffee, measuring out enough for two. The familiar routine felt strange now, performed under watchful eyes he couldn't see. "Thank you," came a soft voice from the buffalo robes. It was barely more than a whisper, but clear and cultured. Not the rough speech he'd grown used to from years of trading with trappers and travelers. Adriel nodded, keeping his movements slow and predictable as he worked. "Coffee'll be ready soon. There's fresh water if you're thirsty." She sat up carefully, keeping the cloth secured around her face. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted it, checking every edge. The buffalo hide pooled around her waist, revealing clothes that had once been fine, but were now travel-worn and patched. "I'm called Bella," she offered after a long moment, her hands folded in her lap, steady now but still tense. "Adriel Grant." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups, extending one toward her. "Careful, it's hot." She took the cup with both hands, fingers careful not to brush his. Through the gaps in the cloth, he caught a glimpse of eyes that seemed to hold more shadows than the dawn outside. She didn't offer a surname, and he didn't ask. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the pop of burning wood and the wind's morning song through the pines. Adriel busied himself with breakfast preparations, giving her space to gather herself. "Please," Bella said suddenly, setting down her empty cup. "Let me help with something. I saw your shirt hanging there. It needs mending." Indeed, his spare shirt hung from a peg, torn from catching on a branch while checking his trap lines. Before he could protest, she was up, moving with surprising steadiness for someone who'd nearly frozen to death the day before. "You should rest," he said, but there was something in her manner that made him hesitate to insist. Perhaps she needed this, some normal task to ground herself. "I'm stronger than I look." She retrieved the shirt and settled back on his bunk, producing a needle and thread from some hidden pocket. Her fingers moved with practiced ease, the stitches small and even. Adriel returned to his morning tasks, but he found himself watching her from the corner of his eye. There was a grace to her movements, a precision that spoke of good breeding. What had driven someone like her into the wilderness alone? "Your family," he ventured carefully, testing the waters. "Will they be searching for you?" Her hands stilled for just a moment before resuming their work. She shook her head once, the gesture final as a door closing. The morning passed in companionable industry. Bella finished the shirt and insisted on helping him clean his traps, her hands sure despite their recent brush with frostbite. She worked without complaint, though he noticed how she positioned herself to keep her face turned away. As afternoon faded toward evening, Adriel prepared a simple supper of rabbit stew. The familiar scent filled the cabin, carrying memories of other meals shared in better times. Bella set 2 places at his rough table, her movements speaking of long habit in more genteel settings. When the food was ready, she surprised him by folding her hands and praying aloud. "Dear Lord, we thank you for this bounty and for the shelter of this place. We ask your blessing on this meal and on this home that has offered sanctuary. Amen." Her voice held such simple conviction that Adriel felt his throat tighten. Sarah used to pray like that, with a faith as natural as breathing. He hadn't heard a blessing said over his table since her passing, hadn't realized how much he'd missed it until this moment. They ate in silence, Bella somehow managing small bites without ever fully removing the cloth from her face. Outside, wolves began their evening song, their howls echoing off the mountainsides. Inside, the The cabin felt warmer than it had in years, filled with something that felt dangerously like hope. The peaceful moment shattered when Bella began to cough. It started small but quickly grew violent, her whole body shaking with the force of it. When she pulled her hand away from her mouth, Adriel saw blood staining her fingers. He moved without thinking, reaching for the cloth that covered her face. "You're hurt! Let me help!" Her reaction was explosive. She jerked away so violently she nearly fell, one hand clamped over her covered mouth, the other held out to ward him off. "No!" The word was ragged, desperate. "Please, you can't!" Adriel froze, his hands raised in surrender. "All right," he said softly, as if calming a spooked horse. "All right, I won't touch it, but if you're injured—" "I'm not," she managed between smaller coughs. "It's just, it will pass. Please." He watched helplessly as she brought the coughing under control, fighting every instinct that urged him to help. When she finally straightened, he could see the toll it had taken. Her shoulders trembled with exhaustion. "Whatever secret you're carrying," he said carefully, "it's safe with me. I give you my word." She studied him for a long moment, her hidden gaze heavy with things unsaid. Finally, she nodded once. "Thank you." The rest of the evening passed quietly. Adriel built up the fire while Bella cleaned their supper dishes, each of them careful to maintain the fragile peace between them. When night fell fully, he insisted she take the bunk again, while he settled into his usual place by the hearth. He didn't mean to stay awake, but sleep proved elusive. The cabin felt different with another person's breath mixing with the fire's crackle. Sometime in the deepest part of night, he heard her voice, soft, almost musical, reciting scripture in her sleep. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." The words drifted through the darkness like a confession. Adriel closed his eyes, remembering other nights when scripture had been a comfort rather than an accusation. The woman's presence had stirred up memories he'd thought safely buried. But strangely, they didn't hurt as much as he'd expected. He sat awake through the long hours, watching the fires dance across the rough-hewn walls. The woman's secret lay between them like a shadow, but somehow it felt less important than the trust that had begun to grow despite it, or perhaps because of it. They were two wounded souls who had found each other in the wilderness, each carrying burdens the other couldn't fully see. The wolves sang again, their voices rising and falling like a wild hymn. Inside the cabin, Bella's whispered prayers continued, mixing with the wind's moan and the fire's steady crackle. Adriel found himself listening, letting the familiar words wash over him like a gentle rain, softening ground long hardened by grief. Whatever brought her to his door, whatever sin or sorrow lay beneath that cloth, he would honor his promise to keep her secret. For now, it was enough that she was here, bringing with her echoes of a faith he'd thought forever lost in the mountain's endless silence. The night deepened around them, full of shadows and unspoken stories. But there was light, too. In the glowing hearth, in the trust beginning to bloom between them, in the ancient words of comfort that filled the darkness with their quiet power. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they were two souls less alone than they had been when the storm began. The blizzard raged for 3 endless days, transforming the world outside into a howling wall of white. Inside the line shack, Adriel Grant maintained his vigil over Bella as fever took hold, turning her restless sleep into a battlefield of memories. The first signs of illness appeared gradually. Her cough deepened, and a flush crept across what little he could see of her face above the ever-present cloth. By nightfall of the first day, she could barely lift her head from the pillow. Just need to rest, she insisted weakly, but Adriel recognized the glassy look in her eyes. He'd seen enough mountain fever to know its early warnings. He brewed willow bark tea and helped her sip it through the cloth, though most of it spilled. The temperature in the cabin stayed warm enough to make him sweat, but she shivered constantly under the pile of buffalo robes. Through the second day, her consciousness drifted like smoke. Sometimes she'd wake enough to thank him for the water he pressed to her lips. Other times, she'd thrash against invisible enemies, her words tumbling out in fragments that made his skin prickle. "Captain Willis," she'd mutter, her voice thick with fear. "The fort. Please, you don't understand." Adriel kept the fire stoked and changed the cool cloths on her forehead, all while piecing together the scattered words that fell from her fevered lips. Something about Fort Bridger, about orders and gold and betrayal. Most often she'd whisper, "Forgive me," over and over like a broken prayer. By the third day, her fever blazed hot enough to frighten him. She no longer responded to his voice, lost in whatever dark memories held her captive. The cloth that covered her face had grown damp with sweat, and her breathing came in shallow gasps. Adriel paced the cabin's length, torn between his promise and his fear for her life. If the fever didn't break soon, he'd seen what mountain fever could do, how it could cook a person's brain until nothing remained but an empty shell. When her temperature spiked higher and her mumbling turned to weak moans, he made his decision. "Forgive me," he whispered, echoing her own words as he carefully began unwrapping the cloth from her face. His hands shook slightly as he removed the last layer. Whatever disfigurement she carried, whatever shame she tried to hide, he would not judge. He'd seen too much of life's cruelty to... The cloth fell away. Adriel stared, uncomprehending. Her face was perfect, unmarred, beautiful even, despite the fever's flush. No scars, no burns, no mark of any kind that would explain her desperate need to hide. For a long moment he couldn't move, couldn't think past the shock of it. Then practicality took over. Whatever her reasons, they weren't his to question now. With gentle hands, he bathed her face with cool water, then carefully replaced the cloth exactly as it had been. Through the rest of that long night, he tended her. Near dawn, her fever finally broke. She fell into real sleep, her breathing deep and even for the first time in days. Adriel dozed in his chair by the bed, waking instantly when she stirred. She sat up slowly, one hand going to her face to check the cloth. Finding it in place, she relaxed slightly. "How long?" Her voice was rough from coughing. 3 days. He passed her a cup of water. "The fever broke this morning." She drank carefully through the cloth, then set the cup aside. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unasked questions. "You saw?" It wasn't a question. Her fingers worried the edge of the blanket. "Yes. No point in lying. When your fever spiked dangerous high." She didn't respond for a long moment. Outside, the storm's fury had diminished to a steady drumming of snow against the roof, like distant gunfire. "Are you going to ask why?" Her voice was barely audible above the storm. "Only if you want to tell me." She drew a shuddering breath. "I'm not what you think. I'm not hiding some vanity or shame about my appearance." Her hands twisted in her lap. "I'm hiding from the army. They're looking for me. They think I..." Her voice caught. "They say I helped murder soldiers at Fort Bridger. That I'm a traitor." Adriel kept his face carefully neutral, though his mind raced. Fort Bridger wasn't far, maybe 4 days' ride in good weather. He'd heard rumors of some trouble there months back, but details were scarce this far into the mountains. "Tell me," he said simply. The story spilled out of her like water from a broken dam. How she'd served as a nurse at the fort, tending both soldiers and local tribes who came seeking help. How she'd been working late one night when a wounded officer stumbled in, babbling about an attack on the gold shipment. "He ordered me to help him move the strongbox," she said, her voice hollow with memory. "Said the raiders were coming, that we had to hide it. I didn't question. He was an officer. He was bleeding, and there was so much confusion. Shots in the dark, shouting." She took a shaking breath. "It was all a lie. He was part of the theft. They killed 3 guards that night, and when it was done, they needed someone to blame. Who better than the nurse who helped move the gold, the woman who couldn't prove her innocence against an officer's word?" "Why did you run?" Adriel asked quietly, though he thought he knew. "Because no one would believe a woman." The words fell between them like stones. "The commander's widow, Mrs. Willis. She had everyone convinced before I could even speak in my defense. Said I'd been seen plotting with raiders, that I'd betrayed everyone's trust." A bitter laugh escaped her. "They didn't even search for the real killers, just needed someone to hang." Snow beat against the cabin's roof like gunfire, but inside, the silence stretched deep and heavy. Adriel studied her. This woman who had stumbled out of a storm carrying such a weight of injustice. He thought of his own past, of grief and loss, and the easy temptation to judge others when your own heart was bitter. But he'd learned something in his years alone in these mountains. Justice and mercy weren't always the same thing. Sometimes the truest test of faith was choosing to believe in someone else's innocence when the whole world had decided their guilt. "I believe you," he said simply. She went very still. "You do?" "A guilty woman doesn't pray in her sleep." He kept his voice gentle. "Doesn't thank God for simple meals or mend a stranger's shirt when she's half frozen herself." She made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh. "I've prayed every day for someone to believe me, just one person who would listen without judgment." Her hands came up to cover her face through the cloth. "I never thought, in the middle of nowhere." "Maybe that's exactly where truth finds us sometimes," Adriel said quietly. Away from all the noise of other people's certainties. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but its fury seemed distant now, unimportant against the fragile trust building in this small, warm space. Adriel rose to add wood to the fire, giving her time to compose herself. "You should rest more," he said finally. "You're still weak from the fever." She nodded, settling back against the pillows. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not just for believing me, but for—" She gestured vaguely at her covered face. "For respecting my need to hide, even when you knew there was nothing to hide from." "We all carry scars that don't show," he replied. "Some just need more protection than others." As she drifted back to sleep, Adriel sat in his chair by the fire, turning over all she'd told him. A woman alone, running from false accusations, carrying truth no one would hear. His mother would have called it providence that led her to his door. He wasn't sure he believed in such things anymore, but watching her peaceful sleep now, he felt something shift in his heart, something that had been frozen for a very long time. The snow continued to fall outside, but inside the cabin a different kind of thaw had begun. The pale winter dawn crept over the ridge, painting the snow-laden pines in shades of pearl and silver. Adriel stood at his frosted window, coffee cup warming his hands as he surveyed the familiar landscape. Something caught his eye. Fresh tracks marring the pristine snow near the ridgeline. His breath hitched as he recognized the distinctive pattern of Army-issue horseshoes. Setting his cup down carefully, he wiped a clearer patch on the glass with his sleeve. There, In the valley below his shack, dark shapes moved through the morning mist. Riders, at least 6 of them, methodically combing the snow-covered ground. Their blue uniforms stood out stark against the white landscape. "Bella," he called softly, not turning from the window. "We have company." She appeared at his shoulder, still wrapped in the buffalo robe he'd given her. One look at the scene below and she stumbled backward, the cloth over her face doing nothing to hide her terror. "They're searching," she whispered. "They must have tracked me from the last settlement." Adriel's mind raced. The patrol would reach his shack within the hour. They'd want to search it, standard procedure in these mountains where outlaws often sought shelter. His gaze fell on the trap door near his bed, leading to the root cellar he'd dug his first winter here. It wasn't much, just enough space to store preserves and keep vegetables from freezing, but it would have to do. "Quick," he said, already moving to pull up the heavy door. "Down here." Bella peered into the dark space. "But they'll find me. They always search cellars first." "Not if we do this right." Adriel was already pulling furs from his bed. Beaver, fox, and wolf pelts he'd trapped that season. "These need to be stretched anyway. I'll cover the door with them, make it look like my winter workspace." Understanding dawned in her eyes. She climbed down the rough-hewn ladder into the cellar without further protest. The space was cramped but dry, lined with shelves of preserved food and roots. Adriel passed down a candle and matches. "Stay quiet, no matter what you hear," he warned, then began arranging the pelts across the trap door. By the time he finished, it looked like any trapper's winter work area, complete with his tools laid out as if he'd just stepped away from cleaning furs. The sound of horses and men's voices grew closer. Adriel moved around his shack, deliberately messing up his bed and leaving breakfast dishes unwashed, the natural chaos of a man living alone. His heart pounded, but his hands were steady. He'd learned long ago that the best lies were the ones wrapped in obvious truths. Heavy boots stamped on his porch, followed by a sharp knock. Adriel took his time answering, as any solitary mountain man would. "Yes?" he asked, opening the door to find 3 soldiers, their breath frosting in the cold air. The sergeant, a weather-beaten man with hard eyes, stepped forward. "Patrol from Fort Bridger, sir, tracking a fugitive. Mind if we look around?" Adriel shrugged, stepping back. "Suit yourself, ain't much to see." The soldiers entered, stamping snow from their boots. 2 began methodically searching the cabin, while the sergeant questioned Adriel. "Seen anyone unusual lately? Woman, traveling alone, might be wearing a veil or face covering?" Adriel scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Ain't seen nobody in weeks, except some Shoshone hunters passing through 3 days back. Storms kept most folks down in the valley." The soldiers upturned his bed, checked his cupboards, even looked up his chimney. One paused near the pelts covering the trap door, and Adriel's throat tightened. "Good season for furs," the man commented, fingering a beaver pelt. "Fair enough," Adriel replied casually, "though the snow's making it hard to check my lines." The sergeant made a final survey of the cabin. "Well, thanks for your cooperation. If you do see anyone matching that description, the fort's offering a reward. She's wanted for murder and theft." "That so?" Adriel kept his voice neutral. "I'll keep an eye out, though most folks who come through here are just passing traders." The soldiers filed out, their boots crunching in the snow. Adriel watched from his door as they mounted up and continued their search along the ridge. Only when they disappeared into the trees did he finally exhale fully. He waited another 10 minutes before moving the pelts and opening the trap door. Bella sat huddled in the corner, the candle burned down to a stub beside her. Her hands trembled as he helped her up. "They're gone," he assured her. "Heading north along the ridge." She stood in the middle of his cabin, arms wrapped tight around herself. "I have to leave," she said suddenly. "I can't stay here. They'll come back, search again. You'll be arrested for harboring a fugitive." "No." The word came out fiercer than he intended. "Please," she begged. "You've already risked too much. I won't bring danger to someone who's shown me nothing but kindness." Adriel moved to stoke the fire, buying time to order his thoughts. The warmth brought color back to Bella's face beneath the cloth, but she remained tense, poised for flight. Finally, he turned to her. "You're safe under my roof," he said firmly. "That's all that matters." "But—" "No buts. Winter's setting in hard. You wouldn't last 2 days out there alone, and we both know it." He gestured to his window, where fresh snow was already beginning to fall. "Besides, I've made my choice. I believe you're innocent, and I won't send you out to die just to keep my conscience clean." Something in his tone must have convinced her. The tension slowly left her shoulders, though worry still lined her eyes above the cloth. "At least let me earn my keep," she said quietly. Adriel nodded toward his leaking roof, where a patch of darker wood showed where snow had been seeping in. "Reckon we could start there. Roof needs mending before the next big storm hits." They spent the rest of the morning working together, Bella passing up boards and nails, while Adriel patched the worst spots in the roof. The physical labor helped ease the lingering tension, and by afternoon they had fallen into a comfortable rhythm. When Adriel climbed down, his clothes covered in snow and sawdust, Bella already had coffee brewing and was preparing the elk meat he'd brought in days before. "Thought we could boil it down for stew," she explained, not meeting his eyes. "Make it last longer." "Good thinking." He hung his wet coat by the fire. "Winter's long up here." They worked side by side in the small kitchen space, Bella chopping vegetables while Adriel trimmed the meat. The familiar tasks filled the cabin with warmth and purpose, so different from his usual solitary evenings. As the stew simmered, Adriel noticed Bella fingering a tear in her face cloth. Without a word, he retrieved his sewing kit, his wife's originally, rarely used since her passing. He held it out to her. "Here, for mending." She took it carefully, but her hands shook too much to thread the needle. Wordlessly, Adriel held out his hand for the cloth. After a moment's hesitation, she handed it over, keeping her face turned away. His stitches were crude but strong, born of years mending his own clothes. As he worked, he spoke quietly, not looking at her. "This ain't for hiding anymore, just for keeping warm, like any sensible piece of cloth up here." When he finished, he handed it back. Bella took it, running her fingers over the neat row of stitches. "Thank you," she whispered, and they both knew she meant more than just the mending. The stew bubbled softly on the stove, filling the cabin with savory steam. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the soldiers, tracks, erasing all signs of the morning's danger. Inside, two people who had both known loneliness and loss shared a meal in companionable silence, letting the simple act of breaking bread together say what words couldn't. Adriel watched Bella carefully sip her stew through the cloth, no longer questioning why she kept it on. Some wounds needed more than just time to heal. Some needed safety first, and trust, and the quiet acceptance of another soul who understood what it meant to carry invisible scars. The evening settled around them like a gentle blanket, and for the first time in years, Adriel's cabin felt like more than just shelter from the storm. It felt like something he'd almost forgotten how to name. It felt like home. The days melted together like snow on pine needles. Morning light found Adriel and Bella falling into comfortable routines, their movements around the cabin becoming an easy dance of shared tasks and quiet understanding. "Here's how you check if the spring's set right," Adriel demonstrated one crisp morning, his breath frosting in the air. He knelt beside a beaver trap, showing Bella how to test the mechanism without catching her fingers. Too loose, and it won't catch. Too tight, and it might break the animal's leg, cause needless suffering. Bella watched intently, her cloth rippling with each breath. "You're gentler with the traps than I expected," she observed. Adriel adjusted the spring carefully. "My pa taught me early on. We take what we need, no more. Show respect for God's creatures, even when we hunt them." He paused, remembering his father's weathered hands guiding his own. "Been a while since I thought about those lessons. Sometimes the old teachings find us again when we need them most," Bella said softly. She knelt beside him, mimicking his movements on another trap. Her fingers, though skilled from years of nursing, fumbled slightly with the unfamiliar mechanism. "Steady now," Adriel guided. "Like that, you've got it." They worked through his trap line, Adriel teaching her to read the signs of animal passages, to spot the likely places where beaver would build, to recognize which spots would hold through winter and which would wash out with spring floods. Bella proved an apt student, her natural compassion extending to wanting the traps to be as humane as possible. In return, during the quiet evenings, Bella drew Adriel back to prayer. It started simply enough, her own quiet devotions by lamplight, her fingers tracing worn Bible pages as she read. Sometimes she would read aloud, her voice soft but clear in the cabin's stillness. "Would you like to join me?" she asked one evening, looking up from her reading. The invitation held no pressure, just gentle welcome. Adriel hesitated. "Been a long time," he admitted. Since my wife passed. Felt like God wasn't listening anymore." "He always listens," Bella said, "even when we're too hurt to speak to him." She turned her Bible toward him. "Would you read with me? Just a few verses?" The familiar words felt strange on his tongue at first, like a language half forgotten. But as they read together, something inside him began to thaw. The prayers he'd buried with Sarah stirred again, not with the sharp pain of loss, but with a quiet remembrance of comfort once known. During these evening readings, Bella gradually shared more about her time at Fort Bridger. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke of her nursing work, the satisfaction of helping others heal. But it trembled when she described the events that led to her flight. "The gold shipment was meant for the Shoshone treaty payment," she explained one night, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "When it vanished, everything fell apart. Mrs. Harrison, the commanding officer's widow, she accused me of helping the thieves because I'd treated some of them in the infirmary, said I must have told them about the shipment's schedule." "But you didn't," Adriel stated, not asking. "No." Bella's voice was firm, despite her trembling hands. "I would never betray that trust. But Mrs. Harrison had influence, and grief can make people see enemies everywhere, after the captain died." Adriel watched her carefully. "Seems convenient, doesn't it? The captain's death, then the gold vanishing right when it was needed most." "What do you mean?" "Just that sometimes the loudest accusations come from those with the most to hide." Adriel stoked the fire thoughtfully. "Did anyone check the widow's accounts after her husband passed?" Bella sat straighter. "You think—" She fell silent, considering. "There were rumors about gambling debts, but nothing was ever proved." "Harder to prove anything when everyone's looking the wrong way," Adriel observed. The conversation lingered in both their minds as days passed. Adriel found himself watching Bella's growing confidence as she learned frontier skills, noting how her natural grace extended to these new tasks. She moved with increasing sureness, whether mending snares or preparing meals. The cloth remained, but it seemed less a barrier now and more simply a part of her, like his own worn coat or boots. One morning, everything changed. Adriel was checking his trapline alone. Bella had stayed behind to dry herbs she'd gathered, when he spotted the tracks. Boot prints, fresh in the new fallen snow, different from the military patrols. These were broader, deeper, made by men used to rough country. Bounty hunters. He hurried back to the cabin, mind racing. They'd have to move fast, before the hunters picked up their trail. The old mission came to mind. A ruin from the early days when trappers and missionaries had tried to establish a presence in these mountains. Few remembered it now, but it would serve as shelter until they could plan their next move. Bella understood the danger as soon as she saw his face. She packed quickly, efficiently, taking only what they truly needed: food, blankets, her precious Bible, medical supplies. Adriel gathered ammunition, extra clothes, and basic tools. Within an hour, they were mounted on his horse, Bella sitting behind him with their supplies secured behind her. They rode through dense pine forest, where the branches hung heavy with snow. Adriel chose their path carefully, using every trick he knew to obscure their trail, crossing streams where possible, staying on rocky ground when they could. Bella held on silently, trusting his guidance. The old mission appeared through the trees as afternoon light was fading. A simple log structure, its cross long fallen, but its walls still solid. Snow fell in lazy spirals as they approached, muffling their horses' hoofbeats. "It's been standing longer than most people realize," Adriel explained as they dismounted. "Trappers used to gather here to trade and pray before the big trading posts were established. Most folks forgot about it after the mission closed." Inside, the single room was dusty but sound. The stone fireplace still drew well, and there were no obvious gaps in the roof. They worked together to make it habitable, sweeping, gathering fresh pine boughs for bedding, setting up their few supplies. As darkness fell, they sat before a small, carefully shielded fire. Bella read from her Bible by its light, her voice soft but steady. "The Lord is my rock, and my fortress, and my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust." Adriel listened, watching the firelight play across the worn pages. Something moved in his heart. Gratitude, he realized. Not just for safety, but for this moment, for the presence of someone who spoke God's name with such quiet certainty. "Thank you," he whispered, not quite meaning to speak aloud. Bella paused in her reading. "For what?" "For bringing prayer back into my life." He gestured to the Bible. "Thought I'd left all that behind with Sarah. Didn't think I'd ever want it back." "God doesn't leave us," Bella said gently. "Sometimes we just need someone to remind us he's still there." The snow continued falling outside, wrapping their refuge in white silence. Inside, two wounded souls began to heal, not despite their scars, but because of what those scars had taught them about faith, trust, and the quiet mercy of second chances. Adriel added wood to the fire, keeping it low but steady. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now they had shelter, warmth, and the comfort of shared belief. He found himself remembering more of his father's prayers, the ones said over trap lines and dinner tables, giving thanks for daily bread and daily grace. Bella resumed reading, her voice blending with the fire's soft crackle. The old mission's walls, which had heard so many prayers over the years, seemed to gather these new ones close, adding them to their long memory of faith and shelter. Outside, the snow erased their tracks, covering the path that had led them here. But inside, they were finding new paths, through trust, through shared danger, through the simple act of believing together. The evening settled around them like a benediction, soft and sure as the falling snow. Morning light filtered through the mission's dusty windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Bella moved carefully through the space, straightening what she could. Her cloth-covered face turned toward each task with purpose, finding comfort in bringing order to the abandoned sanctuary. Near the altar, several wooden pews lay toppled, their aged wood splintered from years of neglect. As she worked to clear the debris, something caught her eye, a metallic glint beneath the broken boards. Kneeling down, Bella brushed aside years of dust and discovered a brass handle attached to what appeared to be a trunk. "Adriel," she called softly. "Could you help me with something?" He crossed the room, boots creaking on the old planks. Together they shifted the broken pews aside, revealing a large military trunk, its surface scarred but intact. A heavy padlock secured the lid. "Army issue," Adriel observed, running his fingers over the worn metal. "Must have been left here during the mission days." Bella examined the lock closely. "I recognize this type. We used similar ones at the fort." She reached beneath her shawl and withdrew a small ring of keys. "I kept my medical supply keys. Maybe—" The third key she tried slid into the lock. With a rusty groan, it turned. Inside, beneath a layer of musty wool blankets, lay several leather-bound books. Bella lifted out the largest, an official army ledger, its pages yellow with age but still clearly legible. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "These are Fort Bridger's financial records," she whispered, scanning the neat columns of numbers and dates. "Supply requisitions, payroll, gold shipments." She turned page after page, her voice growing more intense. "Look at these entries. They're signed by Captain Harrison, but some have been altered." Adriel leaned closer, studying the careful rows of figures. "How can you tell?" "I know Mrs. Harrison's handwriting." Bella's finger traced several lines where numbers had been carefully erased and rewritten. She helped with the fort's paperwork after the captain died. "These amounts, they don't match what I remember from the medical supply records I kept." They spread the ledger on a makeshift table of stacked crates. Sunlight streamed through the high windows as they examined page after page. Bella's nursing experience had required her to maintain precise inventory records, and her eye for detail caught numerous discrepancies. "Here," she said, pointing to a particular entry. "This shows the gold shipment that disappeared was actually larger than reported. The original amount was erased and replaced with a smaller sum, in Mrs. Harrison's hand." Adriel straightened, understanding dawning in his eyes. "She altered the records before accusing you, made it look like less gold was stolen." "Because she'd already taken the difference herself," Bella finished. Her voice shook with a mixture of relief and anger. "Probably over time, through falsified supply requisitions. When the shipment vanished, she blamed me to direct attention away from her own theft." "This proves your innocence," Adriel said firmly. "These records show the real numbers and who changed them." They spent the next 2 days carefully copying the relevant pages. Bella's precise handwriting filled sheet after sheet of paper from her medical kit, documenting dates, amounts, and the telltale alterations. Adriel helped compare figures, ensuring accuracy in their transcription. During their work, they discussed how best to deliver the evidence to Fort Bridger. Direct approach seemed too dangerous. Mrs. Harrison's influence might still be strong enough to prevent the truth from reaching the right authorities. "What about the circuit judge?" Adriel suggested as they worked. "He's independent of the fort's command structure. If we could get these copies to him first." "Judge Matthews," Bella nodded. "He was always fair-minded, and he knew my parents from their missionary work." The task kept them focused through the long hours. Outside, winter winds rattled the mission's timbers, but inside, purpose warmed them more than the carefully maintained fire. They worked by daylight to conserve candles, sharing quiet meals and comfortable silences between bouts of concentrated effort. On the third evening, they finished the last copy. Bella bound the papers carefully together, securing them with thread from her sewing kit. The original ledger they would leave in the trunk, proof that couldn't be destroyed or altered further. As she worked, a soft melody rose from behind her veil. The hymn was gentle, almost unconscious, a habit of comfort learned in childhood. But when the words became clear, Adriel froze in his task of banking the fire. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound!" The notes hung in the air, hauntingly familiar. Sarah had sung that same hymn, in that same way, on quiet evenings in their homestead. The memory struck him like a physical blow, not with the usual sharp pain of loss, but with something deeper, something that ached yet soothed at the same time. Adriel turned away quickly, struggling to master the sudden surge of emotion. The firelight blurred before his eyes as the hymn continued, soft and sweet in the gathering dusk. Above them, wind sighed through the mission's ancient rafters, a sound like peaceful breathing, as if the old building itself shared in some profound relief. Bella's voice faded gently away. Neither spoke for several long moments, letting the echoes settle into the time-worn walls. Finally, Adriel cleared his throat. "We should get some rest," he said gruffly, but not unkindly. "Tomorrow we'll need to plan our next move." They prepared for sleep with quiet efficiency, having fallen into comfortable routine these past days. Bella arranged her bedroll near the banked fire, tucking the copied papers beneath her Bible for safekeeping. Adriel took his usual place closer to the door, rifle within easy reach. The wind continued its lonely song outside, but inside the mission walls, hope had found a home. Like the hidden ledger waiting years to reveal its truth, grace sometimes worked in slow and secret ways. Tonight it worked through copied pages and remembered hymns, through trust given and accepted, through the simple act of believing in justice, yet to come. Moonlight filtered through the high windows, painting silver patterns on the floor between their sleeping places. In that gentle light, the old mission held its secrets close, both those newly discovered in its hidden trunk and those still waiting to be revealed in the hearts of its temporary inhabitants. The night deepened around them, full of possibility, but for now, they rested in the shelter of proven truth and renewed purpose, while above them, the wind whispered ancient prayers into the mountain darkness. Morning light crept through the mission windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. The fierce storm that had kept them sheltered for days had finally loosened its grip on the mountains. Outside, fresh snow blanketed the world in pristine white, and the wind had settled to a gentle whisper through the pines. Adriel stood in the doorway, studying the brightening sky. His breath formed small clouds in the crisp air as he mentally charted his route to Fort Bridger. Behind him, Bella moved quietly through their morning routine, though her movements betrayed her unease about his imminent departure. "The mule's ready," he said, turning back inside. "Should make good time while the snow's still firm." Bella nodded, her veiled face tilted downward as she wrapped the precious ledger copies in oilcloth. The passes should be clear enough now. She secured the package with careful knots, then held it out to him. "Please be careful with these. They're all I have to prove my innocence." Adriel took the bundle, tucking it safely into his saddlebags. "I'll guard them with my life." He paused, watching her adjust the cooking pots near the hearth. "You should stay here where it's safe. I can make better time alone and—" "I should go with you," Bella interrupted, her voice firm despite its softness. "These are my papers, my proof. It's my life at stake. Exactly why you need to stay hidden." Adriel moved closer, his expression earnest. "The closer we get to the fort, the more dangerous it becomes. If something goes wrong, better one of us gets caught than both." Bella's hands stilled on the iron pot. "I've been running and hiding for months. I should face this directly." "You will," Adriel assured her. "But first let me get these papers to Judge Matthews. Once he sees the evidence, he can protect you properly." He touched her shoulder gently. "Give me 1 week. If I'm not back by then, you'll know something's wrong." She stood, silent for a long moment, conflict evident in her rigid posture. Finally, her shoulders slumped slightly. "Promise me you'll be careful. These people, they've already proven how far they'll go to protect their secrets." "I promise." Adriel's voice was steady. 1 week. Keep the fire burning." The sun had just cleared the eastern peaks when Adriel led his horse and mule out of the mission's shelter. He'd loaded them carefully, enough supplies for a week's hard travel, the precious ledger copies secured where they'd stay dry, his rifle close at hand. Snow crunched beneath the animals' hooves as they picked their way down the narrow trail. Bella stood in the doorway, her figure small against the old stone walls. Adriel turned in his saddle for one last look, committing the image to memory. The morning sun catching the edges of her veil, her hand raised in farewell. Then he faced forward, nudging his horse into a steady walk. The day stretched before him, clear and cold. He crossed 3 frozen creeks before noon, the ice thick enough to bear his mount's weight. The valley spread wide and white, broken only by stands of pine and the occasional rocky outcrop. In summer, these meadows blazed with wildflowers. Now they lay silent under winter's blanket, beautiful but treacherous for the unwary traveler. Each night, Adriel made camp in sheltered spots, once in a hollow beneath a fallen cedar, once in the lee of a granite boulder, always where his fire would be hidden from distant eyes. He kept the flames small, just enough to warm some coffee and heat his simple meals. The ledger papers never left his sight, tucked inside his coat while he slept. His thoughts often turned to Bella, alone in the old mission. He'd left her well supplied with firewood and food, but solitude could wear on the strongest spirit. Yet something told him she drew strength from that sacred space, finding comfort in its weathered walls and quiet dignity. On the 4th day, as he picked his way through a narrow pass, a familiar whistle caught his attention. He reined in, watching carefully as an old trapper emerged from the trees ahead. Adriel recognized Sam Wheeler, a grizzled mountain man who'd worked these ranges for decades. "Adriel Grant," the old man called softly, leading his own mule forward. "Ain't seen you this far south in many a moon." "Sam." Adriel nodded in greeting. "How's the hunting?" "Lean times?" Sam glanced behind him before continuing in a lower voice. "Been more soldiers than game lately. Army patrols everywhere, asking questions about that mess at Fort Bridger. Arresting folks they say helped with the gold theft." He spat into the snow. "Even grabbed old Joe last week, just for saying he'd seen a woman matching their description." Adriel kept his expression neutral, though his hand tightened on the reins. "Seems a waste of manpower in this weather." "Ain't it, though?" Sam shook his head. "Whatever happened at that fort, somebody important wants it buried. Deep. You do well to steer clear of the whole business." He squinted at Adriel. "You're heading toward the fort." "Got some furs to trade." The lie came easily. "Thought I'd try my luck at the trading post." Sam studied him for a long moment. "Might want to wait a spell. Weather's fixing to turn nasty again." His meaningful look made it clear he wasn't just talking about snow. They shared coffee from Sam's battered pot, exchanging the sparse news of the mountains. When they parted, The old trapper headed north, while Adriel continued south, his mind churning with this new information. The patrols were casting a wider net than he'd expected. He'd need to be even more cautious now. Meanwhile, back at the mission, Bella kept herself busy with small tasks that slowly transformed the abandoned building. She swept years of dust from corners, arranged their meager supplies with careful precision, and tended the hearth fire as if it were a living thing. Her prayers were constant companions, whispered while she worked or spoken aloud in the quiet evening hours. She prayed for Adriel's safety, for justice to prevail, for strength to face whatever lay ahead. The familiar words brought comfort, echoing off stone walls that had heard countless prayers before hers. On the third day of Adriel's absence, she discovered a chest of old fabric in a back room. Worn altar cloths and faded curtains, carefully stored away when the mission was abandoned. Her fingers, well trained in medical stitching, itched to give these materials new purpose. Using a needle from her medical kit and thread carefully unraveled from the more damaged pieces, Bella began creating new curtains for the mission's windows. As she worked, she found herself making plans that surprised her. This window would catch the morning sun perfectly for herb drying. That alcove could hold shelves for medical supplies. The old altar could become a work table for tending the sick. "This won't just be a hiding place," she whispered to the empty room, her needle flashing in the afternoon light. "Someday it will be a home again, a place of healing." The rhythm of her stitching became another form of prayer, each careful seam a declaration of hope. She worked steadily, transforming the old cloth into something new and useful, just as she hoped her own life might be transformed once the truth was finally known. The mission's silence no longer felt oppressive, but contemplative, like the quiet of a garden waiting for spring. Through the windows, she could see the vast mountain landscape, beautiful even in its winter severity. This high, lonely place had offered her shelter when she most needed it. Perhaps, she thought, that was no accident. As dusk approached each day, she lit the lamps and stoked the fire, making sure its glow would be visible through the window that faced the trail. A beacon for Adriel's return, but also a symbol of her trust in God's providence. She had spent so many months running, hiding in shadows. Now, though still in hiding, she felt as if she were finally standing still long enough for light to find her. The days passed slowly, marked by the sun's movement across the chapel floor and the steady progress of her sewing. She found herself humming hymns as she worked, the old songs rising naturally to her lips. The music seemed to fill the empty spaces, making the waiting more bearable. Each evening, she read from her Bible by lamplight, the familiar words taking on new meaning in her current circumstances. Stories of exile and return, of justice delayed but not denied, of faith tested and refined. They spoke to her situation with fresh relevance. But always her thoughts returned to Adriel, imagining his progress through the winter landscape. She pictured him making his solitary camps, keeping the precious ledger safe, risking his own freedom to help restore hers. The trust between them had grown so gradually, she hadn't realized its depth until now, in his absence. So she stitched and prayed and waited, watching the snow-covered trail through curtains that grew more complete with each passing day. The mission slowly transformed around her, no longer just a refuge, but a promise. A place that might someday offer shelter to others in need of healing and hope. Each morning, she rose with the sun and worked to keep that promise alive, her needle weaving together fragments of faith into something stronger than fear. And each night, she tended the fire that would guide Adriel home, trusting that the light of truth would prove brighter than the darkness of lies. The sun had long since dipped behind the mountains when Adriel approached Fort Bridger's weathered walls. Torchlight flickered against the rough-hewn timber, casting dancing shadows across the snow. His breath frosted in the cold night air as he guided his horse toward the gate, where 2 sentries stood at attention. "Hold there." The younger guard raised his rifle. "State your business." Adriel reached slowly into his coat, drawing out a worn leather folder. "Adriel Grant, licensed trapper for these territories." The documents, creased and stained from years in the wilderness, still bore clear stamps from the territorial office. The older sentry stepped forward, lifting his lantern. Recognition flickered across his weathered face. "I know you, Grant. You traded furs here last spring." He examined the license carefully, then nodded. "Let him pass, Jenkins. He's legitimate." The heavy gates creaked open just wide enough for Adriel and his mount. Inside, the fort was quiet, save for the stamp of cavalry horses in their stables and the distant murmur of voices from the barracks. Oil lamps cast pools of yellow light across the packed earth of the parade ground, now frozen hard as iron. Adriel dismounted stiffly, leading his horse toward the hitching post near the chapel. The small building stood apart from the other structures, its simple cross visible against the star-filled sky. Light glowed behind its single window. The chaplain was still awake. Before approaching the chapel door, Adriel checked that the ledger was secure inside his coat. His fingers brushed the worn leather cover, remembering Bella's face as she'd handed it to him. So much rested on these pages, and the man he'd come to see. He knocked softly on the chapel door. After a moment, it opened to reveal Chaplain Thomas Moore, a slight man with kind eyes and silver threading through his dark hair. The chaplain blinked in surprise at finding a mountain man on his doorstep at this hour. "Can I help you, friend?" Moore asked, his voice gentle but cautious. "I need to speak with you about Bella Wills," Adriel said quietly. The chaplain's expression shifted from wariness to sharp attention. He glanced past Adriel into the darkness, then stepped back. "Come inside, quickly." The chapel interior was warm and smelled of lamp oil and pine. A small desk near the altar was covered with papers. The chaplain had clearly been working late. Moore gestured for Adriel to sit in one of the front pews while he closed and latched the door. "You know Miss Wills?" Moore asked, settling onto the pew across the aisle. "She's alive," Adriel said simply, "and innocent of what they accused her of." The chaplain's shoulders sagged with visible relief. "Thank God," he whispered. "I've prayed for her safety every day since she fled." His eyes grew distant. "She saved my life, you know. When the fever swept through the fort last winter, she stayed at my bedside for 3 days straight, cooling my brow and forcing medicine down my throat when I was too delirious to swallow." Adriel nodded slowly. This matched what he'd seen of Bella's character, her gentle determination, her unwavering care for others. "She told me what happened with the gold shipment, about the widow's accusations." "Mrs. Clayton?" Moore's voice hardened slightly at the name. "She blamed Bella for everything after the captain died, said Bella must have been working with the thieves, must have deliberately kept the captain too weak to stop them." He shook his head. "But I never believed it. Bella Wills has more goodness in her little finger than most have in their whole being." Reaching into his coat, Adriel withdrew the ledger. "We found this at the old mission up in Wind River. I think you'll find it interesting reading." The chaplain took the book with careful hands. As he began to examine the entries, his eyes widened. "These numbers, these signatures," he looked up sharply. "This proves the widow was involved. She and her brother arranged the whole thing." "Will you testify to that?" Adriel asked. "Your word carries weight here." Moore closed the ledger with conviction. "I'll do more than testify. I'll take this directly to Colonel Harrison tomorrow morning. He's been troubled by this case from the start. Felt something wasn't right about how quickly Mrs. Clayton pushed for Bella's arrest. He tucked the B ledger safely into his desk drawer. The truth will come out now. Then I need to get back to her, Adriel said, rising. She's waiting at the mission. Wait. Moore gripped Adriel's arm. Let us pray first, for her safety, for justice to prevail, for God's protection over you both. Adriel hesitated. It had been years since he'd prayed with another person. But Bella's quiet faith had begun to soften something in him, like spring sun melting river ice. He nodded and bowed his head. The chaplain's words were simple but heartfelt, asking for divine guidance and protection. As the familiar cadence of prayer filled the small chapel, Adriel found himself adding his own silent plea, not just for Bella's safety, but for the chance to see her smile without fear shadowing her eyes. Meanwhile, high in the mountains, Bella stood at the mission's window, watching the wind stir the pines. Something had changed in the air. The bitter edge of winter had softened, bringing hints of the thaw to come. The evening breeze carried a dampness that spoke of spring, though that season was still months away. She had spent the day cleaning the mission's small kitchen, making it properly useful for the first time in years. The work helped keep her mind from worrying about Adriel, though her prayers for his safety never truly ceased. As darkness fell, she built up the fire and settled beside it with her mending. Without conscious thought, she began to sing softly, an old hymn her mother had taught her, about God's faithful guidance through dark valleys. The familiar melody filled the quiet space, and she felt some of her anxiety ease. How many others had found comfort in this place over the years? The very walls seemed to hold memories of prayer and praise. The fire popped and crackled, accompanying her song. She worked steadily by its light, her needle flashing as she repaired a tear in one of Adriel's spare shirts. The simple domestic task brought an unexpected peace. After so many months of running, of looking over her shoulder, it felt like a small act of faith to plan for tomorrow. Morning came with pearl gray light filtering through the windows. Bella woke early, knowing she needed to gather more firewood before the day grew warm enough to soften the snow. She wrapped herself in Adriel's spare coat and stepped outside, breathing in the changed air. The woodpile had dwindled faster than she'd expected. She would need to venture a bit further into the trees to find enough dry branches. Keeping close to the mission walls, she made her way carefully through the snow, gathering what she could carry. A movement caught her eye, far down the valley, where the old trading trail wound between the peaks. Her heart stuttered as she made out two riders, their horses picking their way through the snow. Even at this distance, something about their purposeful progress sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the morning air. Sheltered behind a pine trunk, she watched them draw closer. The men rode with the easy confidence of experienced trackers, and their gear marked them as hunters, but not the kind who pursued elk or beaver. These were the widow's men, the ones who'd been searching for her since her flight from the fort. Fear clawed at her throat, threatening to freeze her in place. But Bella forced herself to move, to think. She hurried back to the mission, her arms full of forgotten firewood. Inside, she barred the heavy door and moved quickly to the back room where Adriel kept his old rifle. Her hands trembled as she checked the weapon was loaded, just as Adriel had shown her. The familiar words of the 23rd Psalm fell from her lips as she worked, steadying her nerves. The rifle felt awkward and heavy in her hands, but she positioned herself near a window where she could watch the approach to the mission. "Please hurry back, Adriel," she whispered, dividing her attention between the distant riders and the trail that led toward Fort Bridger. "Please God, keep him safe and bring him home soon." The morning sun climbed higher, melting frost from the window panes. Bella remained at her post, the rifle ready, praying her faith would prove stronger than her fear. The riders were still far off, but drawing steadily closer. Soon they would be near enough to spot the smoke from her chimney. She thought of the ledger, safely away with Adriel, and drew strength from knowing the truth would soon come to light. Whatever happened in the coming hours, she was no longer just hiding. She was standing her ground, protecting not only herself, but this place of sanctuary that had sheltered her when she most needed it. The wind stirred the prayer flags she'd hung outside the window, their soft fluttering a reminder that she wasn't truly alone. God had guided her this far, through darker valleys than this. She adjusted her grip on the rifle and kept watch, her prayers never ceasing as morning crept toward noon and the riders drew ever closer to her refuge. Dusk painted long shadows across the mission floor as Bella watched the two riders approach through gaps in the curtains. Her heart thundered in her chest, but her mind remained clear, focused on survival. The rifle felt heavy in her trembling hands, yet she gripped it firmly, remembering Adriel's patient instructions on its use. The riders drew their horses to a stop in the trampled snow before the mission door. Their spurs jingled as they dismounted, the sound sharp in the evening quiet. Bella pressed herself against the wall beside the door, holding her breath as heavy boots climbed the wooden steps. A fist hammered against the weathered boards. "Open up, we're looking for someone." Bella remained silent, praying they would leave. The second man's voice carried through the door, harder than the first. "We know someone's inside. Smoke from the chimney." More pounding. "Last chance before we break it down. We're hunting a traitor woman seen in these parts." Taking a deep breath, Bella moved to the door but didn't open it. She rapped twice on the wood to show she heard them. "That's better," the first voice said. "Open up now." She knocked again, then made a wordless sound in her throat, the kind she'd heard from patients too injured to speak. Let them think her mute, simple perhaps, less likely to be hiding fugitives. "Something wrong with your voice?" the second man called. She tapped once for yes. A pause, then, "We need to search inside. Army business." Bella's mind raced. If she refused, they'd know something was wrong. If she let them in. Her fingers tightened on the rifle stock. Slowly, she unbarred the door and stepped back into the shadows, keeping the weapon hidden behind her skirts. The door creaked open. The first man stepped inside, snow melting from his boots onto the floorboards. He was tall and lean, with hard eyes that swept the room. His companion remained in the doorway, hand resting near his pistol. "Living here alone?" the first man asked. Bella nodded, keeping her face down, meek. He took another step forward. "Won't take but a minute to check the place. Looking for a woman named Bella Wills. Nurse, pretty thing by accounts. Killed some soldiers up at Fort Bridger." The lies twisted in Bella's gut like knife blades. These weren't army men. Their clothes were too worn, their manner too rough. Bounty hunters, hired by the widow. They'd shoot her dead and claim self-defense. The man moved toward the back room. "Just need to make sure you're not hiding." Bella raised the rifle in one fluid motion and fired over his head. The shot cracked through the mission like thunder, splintering wood above the doorframe. Both men stumbled back, cursing. The first man reached for his gun, but his companion grabbed his arm. "Come on," he shouted. "She's got the high ground." They scrambled down the steps, boots slipping in the snow. Bella moved to the doorway, rifle still raised. The men swung onto their horses, wheels spraying ice as they turned. "This ain't over," the first man shouted back. "We'll return with soldiers. Hold patrol. You'll hang for harboring a murderer." Their threats faded into the gathering dark. Bella's legs gave way, and she sank to the floor, rifle across her knees. Her hands shook as reaction set in, but pride bloomed beneath the fear. She'd stood her ground, protected herself. The night stretched endless before her. She barred the door, then began dragging furniture to block the windows. Every shadow made her jump. Every creak of the old building sent her heart racing. But she kept working, kept moving. Near midnight, she sat at the kitchen table with paper and pencil. Tears blurred her vision as she wrote. "Dearest Adriel, don't risk yourself for me. These men will return with others. I won't have your blood on my conscience. Ride north. Find safety. Know that you restored my faith in good men and in God's mercy." She folded the note and placed it where he would find it, should he return. Then she knelt beside her bed and prayed for strength to face whatever morning might bring. Meanwhile, many miles away, Adriel was already riding hard toward her. He'd left Fort Bridger at first light, Chaplain Moore's written testimony secure in his saddlebags. The chaplain himself rode beside him, having insisted on coming to help clear Bella's name in person. "Weather's turning," Moore called over the wind. "Unusual for March." Adriel nodded, studying the heavy clouds rolling in from the west. Already fat snowflakes were beginning to fall, thick and wet, the kind that could bury trails in hours. They pushed on as the storm worsened. Snow filled their tracks almost as soon as they made them. The familiar road disappeared beneath deepening drifts, forcing them to navigate by landmarks alone. Adriel's worry grew with every hour. Something in his gut told him Bella needed him, and soon. "We should find shelter," Moore suggested as the wind rose. "Wait it out." But Adriel pressed forward, trusting his horse to find solid footing. He'd survived worse storms in these mountains. And somewhere ahead, a woman who'd reawakened his faith waited, perhaps in danger. He would not fail her, as he'd failed his wife years ago. The snow fell harder, erasing the boundaries between earth and sky. Still, they rode on through the white silence, guided by Adriel's instincts and God's mercy. Behind them, Fort Bridger and its secrets faded into the storm. Ahead lay truth, justice, and perhaps redemption for them all. Moore began humming an old hymn, barely audible above the wind. The familiar tune steadied them both as they made their slow way through the deepening snow, each step bringing them closer to the mission where Bella kept her lonely vigil. Inside the mission, Bella remained awake, rifle ready, watching the night deepen outside her windows. The first shot she'd fired had changed something in her. No longer was she simply hiding, waiting to be found. She was defending what was right, standing against lies with truth as her shield. The snow fell thicker now, curtaining the windows in white. She added wood to the fire, its warmth a comfort in the vast darkness. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she faced it now not as a fugitive, but as a woman of courage and conviction. Her prayers rose with the smoke, carrying hope into the storm-filled night. The hours crept past like wounded things. Every sound brought her to alert readiness. A branch breaking under snow's weight, wind moaning through the rafters, ice splitting in the bitter cold. But she kept her vigil, moving between windows, checking her defenses, conserving ammunition for when she might truly need it. She thought of Adriel, hopefully safe at Fort Bridger, and prayed he would heed her note when he found it. Better one heart broken than 2 lives lost. He had already given her more than she could have hoped for: shelter, belief in her innocence, and the rekindling of her faith when she'd thought it extinguished forever. The fire burned low. Bella added the last log, knowing she'd need to venture out for more wood before dawn. The snow had drifted against the door. She could see it seeping beneath, white fingers reaching for her across the floor. But she wasn't afraid anymore. God had led her this far. Whatever path lay ahead, she would walk it with courage, one step at a time. Snow crunched beneath hooves as Adriel guided his exhausted mount up the final ridge. 2 days of hard riding through treacherous drifts had left both horse and rider near collapse, but determination drove them forward. The chaplain had fallen behind hours ago, his older horse unable to maintain the punishing pace. The bitter wind shifted, carrying with it an acrid scent that made Adriel's heart skip. Smoke. Not the sweet wood smoke of a hearth, but the harsh stench of destruction. His horse's ears pricked forward, sensing its rider's sudden tension. Cresting the hill, Adriel pulled hard on the reins. The sight before him drove the breath from his lungs. Where the mission had stood proud against the mountains now rose only blackened timbers and curling smoke. Flames still licked at what remained of the roof, sending sparks spiraling into the steel-gray sky. "No," he whispered, voice cracking. "Dear God, no!" He spurred his horse down the slope, snow spraying from its hooves. As they drew closer, the devastation became clearer. The windows were shattered, their frames charred. The door hung askew on melted hinges. Boot prints churned the snow around the building. Many men had been here, methodically destroying everything. Soldiers. They must have found her. Adriel dismounted before his horse fully stopped, stumbling in the deep snow. The heat of the flames struck his face as he approached the ruins. "Bella!" he shouted, knowing there would be no answer. "Bella!" Only the crack and pop of burning wood replied. He circled the building frantically, searching for any sign. The snow was trampled everywhere, overlapping tracks telling a story of violence. Here, multiple sets of boots converging. There, a smaller set, woman's boots, running. His throat tightened. Something caught his eye in a drift near what had been the back door, a corner of leather peeking through white. Adriel dropped to his knees, fingers clawing at the snow until he freed a small book. Bella's journal, its edges blackened but its pages mostly intact. It must have been thrown clear when they... He couldn't finish the thought. With trembling hands, he opened the journal. Bella's neat script filled the pages, telling the story of their days together, her growing trust, her rediscovered faith. The final entry was dated just yesterday. "The men returned as promised, more this time. I hear them outside, soldiers' voices mixing with the bounty hunters. They're demanding I surrender, claiming they have orders to burn me out if needed. I won't give them that satisfaction. There's a chance through the back while they focus on the front. If he finds this, tell him I forgive." The words ended there, mid-sentence, as if she'd been interrupted. Ink splattered across the page where her pen had dropped. Adriel collapsed forward, his forehead pressing into the snow. The cold bit into his skin, but he welcomed it. It was better than the crushing weight in his chest, the howling emptiness where hope had lived moments before. He had failed her. Just as he had failed Sarah years ago, he hadn't been here when Bella needed him most. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. The fire behind him died down, its heat fading. Finally, forcing himself to move, Adriel lifted his head. He had to know for certain, had to find evidence. The thought made him sick, but he owed her that much. Standing on shaky legs, he began a methodical search of the area. The soldiers' tracks were clear enough. They'd surrounded the building, then set fires at multiple points. But as he worked his way outward, he found something that made his heart stutter. A single set of tracks, half filled with fresh snow but still visible, leading away from the chaos. Small boots, running south toward the creek. Hope flared like a spark in darkness. These tracks were made after the main group had left. The snow depths proved it, and they were deliberate, not the stumbling gait of someone wounded. Bella's tracks. She had escaped. Adriel ran back to his horse, grabbed his tracking gear, and returned to study the trail. Yes, she'd been clever, using the soldiers' churned paths to hide her initial direction, then breaking away once she reached untouched snow. The tracks led into a stand of pines, then emerged heading south along the creek bed. Twilight was gathering, the short winter day already fading. Common sense said to make camp, wait for the chaplain to catch up. But Adriel knew he couldn't stop. Not now. He mounted up, guided his horse to the trail, and urged it forward. The beast was tired but willing, sensing its rider's desperate need. They followed the creek as darkness fell. The tracks grew fainter with each passing hour as new snow filtered down, but Adriel could read them by touch when his eyes failed, feeling the compressed snow beneath his boots during frequent stops to verify direction. His world narrowed to the next hoofprint, the next bent twig, the next sign that Bella had passed this way. When full dark made even this impossible, he finally stopped. His horse needed rest, and he had to maintain enough strength to help Bella when he found her. He made a small camp in a hollow beneath spreading pine boughs, where the snow was thinner. As he sat beside his tiny fire, the sky above began to glow. Pale green ribbons of light unfurled across the stars, the aurora borealis, dancing in the crystal-clear night. Adriel stared up at the ethereal display, remembering how Bella had once described it as God's lamp, lighting the way home. "I swear it," he said, aloud, his voice strong despite his exhaustion. "If she's still breathing, I'll clear her name or die trying." The words rang in the stillness, witnessed by stars and aurora alike. It wasn't just a promise. It was a covenant, as binding as any he'd ever made. He touched the journal in his coat pocket, feeling its scorched leather beneath his fingers. The last words she'd written echoed in his mind. "Tell him I forgive." The sentence hung unfinished, like a thread waiting to be woven into something whole. He would find her. He would hear those words completed from her own lips. Sleep was impossible. Adriel spent the night alternating between tending his small fire and pacing to keep warm, watching the aurora paint the snow in ghostly colors. His mind turned over plans, possibilities. The chaplain would eventually catch up, bringing official proof of Bella's innocence. But Adriel couldn't wait for that. She was out here alone, in winter, with who knew how many soldiers still searching. His horse nickered softly in the darkness. The beast had served him faithfully for years, sharing his solitary life in the mountains. Now it would share this quest too, however long it took. Adriel gave it the last handful of oats from his saddlebag and checked its legs for signs of strain. They would ride at first light, following that tenuous trail south until they found her. The aurora continued its silent dance overhead, reminding him of another night years ago, when he'd sat beside Sarah's grave, promising never to love again. How strange that God would lead him here, making him break that promise to keep a deeper one, the promise to protect those who needed shelter, to stand for truth when lies seemed stronger. He touched the cross Sarah had given him, which still hung around his neck. "Watch over her," he whispered, meaning both women now. "Keep her safe until I can reach her." The night grew colder. Adriel wrapped himself in his blanket and leaned against a tree trunk, but his eyes remained open, fixed on the southern horizon. Somewhere out there, Bella was hiding, probably cold and afraid, but alive. He clung to that certainty like a drowning man to driftwood. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The snow might cover her tracks completely. The soldiers might find her first. She might be forced to leave the creek for safer paths. But he would not stop searching. He would not fail her as he had failed before. The aurora's light began to fade as false dawn touched the eastern sky. Adriel rose, stiff from the cold, and began breaking camp. As he saddled his horse, he touched the journal once more, drawing strength from its survival. Like its owner, it had passed through fire and emerged scarred but intact. Now it would help lead him to her. The horse stamped impatiently, eager to move in the bitter morning air. Adriel swung into the saddle, oriented himself by the brightening horizon, and pressed on southward. The creek's course would guide him, and God's mercy would do the rest. Somewhere ahead, Bella waited, her unfinished sentence a bridge between past and future, between loss and hope. He would find her. He would hear those words completed, and together they would face whatever came after, strong in the knowledge that some bonds, once forged in trial and trust, could neither be burned away nor buried in snow. The sun rose behind him as he rode, casting his shadow long across the pristine drifts. Another day of searching began, each hoofprint bringing him closer to fulfilling his vow. Dawn broke pale and uncertain over the frozen river. Rays of early sunlight caught the ice crystals hanging in the air, turning them to floating diamonds. Adriel's horse picked its way carefully along the riverbank, following Bella's trail that grew clearer with each passing minute. A sound carried on the wind. Voices. Adriel reined his mount to a stop, listening intently. There, through the skeletal winter trees, he caught glimpses of movement. His heart seized. A patrol of 6 soldiers stood by the river's edge, and in their midst stood Bella. She was alive. The relief that flooded through him nearly made him dizzy. But she wasn't free. Her hands were bound before her with rough rope, her head bowed in defeat. The veil she'd worn for so long was gone, her face exposed to the bitter morning air. Without thinking, Adriel spurred his horse forward. Snow exploded beneath its hooves as they charged down the slope toward the group. He raised his rifle, mind racing through possibilities. He could shoot the ropes, cause a distraction, give her a chance to run. "Don't fight them!" Bella's cry rang out sharp and clear. Her eyes met his, filled with a desperate plea. "Please, Adriel, no more violence." The soldiers had their weapons trained on him now. Adriel's finger tensed on the trigger, everything in him screaming to protect her. But something in Bella's face, a quiet dignity, an acceptance he didn't understand, made him slowly lower the rifle. "Dismount," ordered the sergeant. "Hands where we can see them." Adriel complied, his movements deliberate and calm, though his heart thundered in his chest. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he stepped down. One of the soldiers quickly bound his hands while another took his weapons. "I'm sorry," Bella whispered as they were brought together. "I tried to hide, but—" "Quiet," snapped the sergeant. "You'll both have plenty of time to talk on the way to Fort Bridger." They were marched to where the patrol's horses waited. Adriel's own mount was tied to one of the soldiers' horses, his gear searched and confiscated. They were helped onto their mounts, hands still bound, and the group set out with the rising sun at their backs. The day passed in tense silence. Adriel watched Bella whenever he could, trying to read her condition. She seemed tired but unharmed, though something haunted her eyes beyond their current situation. As dusk approached, the sergeant called a halt to make camp. The soldiers were efficient, professional. They built a fire, posted guards, shared their rations. Though prisoners, Adriel and Bella were treated without cruelty, given food, water, and blankets as they sat near the flames. When the guards stepped back to give them a moment of privacy, Bella leaned close to Adriel. "There's something I have to tell you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Before they caught me, I burned part of the ledger." Adriel's breath caught. What? I was afraid they would find it, use it to prove you helped me. I couldn't let you suffer for my sins. Her words tumbled out in a rush of guilt. I'm so sorry, I've ruined everything. Snowflakes began to fall, catching in Bella's hair like a crown of thorns. Adriel looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not a fugitive or a nurse or even a friend. He saw a soul as wounded as his own, trying to protect what little good she'd found in the world. Faith ain't a ledger, he said softly. It's grace. The words hung between them as snow continued to fall, muffling the world until it seemed they were alone in a cocoon of white. Bella's eyes filled with tears that didn't fall. She nodded once, accepting both his forgiveness and the deeper truth behind it. The fire popped and hissed as snow melted in its flames. Around them, the soldiers moved about their duties, checking horses and adjusting equipment. But in that small space between prisoner and prisoner, a different kind of freedom had been found. The liberty that comes with being known, being understood, being forgiven. Silence settled over the camp like the falling snow, broken only by the whisper of wind through bare branches and the occasional stamp of a tethered horse. Whatever tomorrow would bring, whatever justice or injustice awaited them at Fort Bridger, they would face it knowing that some bonds couldn't be broken by rope or circumstance. The ledger might be ashes, but truth, like grace, had a way of making itself known. The iron gates of Fort Bridger groaned open like the maw of some great beast. Soldiers marched Bella and Adriel through the muddy yard, past whitewashed buildings and curious onlookers. Steam rose from the horses' flanks in the cold morning air. 2 guards seized Bella's arms, dragging her toward a converted storeroom near the fort's edge. The heavy door creaked open, revealing bare walls and a dirt floor scattered with straw. They thrust her inside, the lock clicking with brutal finality. Through the small barred window, Bella watched the widow approach Adriel in the yard. Mrs. Willis stood straight-backed in her black dress, a vulture circling wounded prey. Her voice carried across the yard, dripping with false concern. Mr. Grant, surely you understand. The woman manipulated you. Sign this statement admitting she led you astray, and you'll go free. Refuse, and you'll share her cell until trial. Adriel's face remained stone still, but Bella saw his hands clench at his sides. Before he could respond, the chaplain appeared, leaning heavily on a cane. His face was flushed with fever, yet his voice rang clear. I have testimony regarding the ledger, he wheezed. I'll speak at the hearing. Mrs. Willis's smile tightened. If you're well enough to attend, chaplain. Later, as evening shadows lengthened, Bella knelt on the packed earth floor. Lord, she whispered, forgive them all, even her. A soft scraping drew her attention. Adriel stood at the window, pressing his worn leather Bible through the bars. Don't lose heart, he murmured. Bella's fingers brushed his as she took the book. Before she could speak, guards appeared, pulling him away into the gathering dark. Adriel, she whispered, pressing her face against the cold iron bars. His name fell into silence, a prayer unto itself. In her hands, the small Bible held warmth like a beating heart. Morning light filtered through the charred beams of the mission chapel. Soldiers and settlers filled the blackened pews, their breath clouding in the cold air. Bella stood before them, chin held high despite her trembling hands. Adriel watched from nearby, every muscle tense. The makeshift tribunal had gathered in the burned sanctuary, a fitting place for truth to emerge from ashes. Colonel Harrison sat at a rough-hewn table, papers spread before him like a fan of playing cards. Sudden commotion drew all eyes to the door. The chaplain stumbled in, supported by 2 privates. His face was ashen, sweat beading on his brow despite the chill. In his shaking hand, he clutched a sealed letter. "The commander's last words," he wheezed, presenting the envelope to Colonel Harrison. "Written on his deathbed 3 months ago." Mrs. Willis surged forward, reaching for the letter, but 2 soldiers held her back. The colonel broke the seal and read aloud. "I confess before God, the gold was taken by myself and Rawlins's smuggling gang. We framed the nurse to cover our theft. May the Lord have mercy on my soul." The widow's scream pierced the chapel. "Lies! All lies!" She thrashed against the soldier's grip, her composure shattering like ice. Colonel Harrison rose, his voice steady. "By God's grace and justice, Miss Will stands cleared of all charges. Let it be recorded." The rifles lowered one by one. Sunlight suddenly burst through the broken roof, painting golden paths across the scorched floorboards. Adriel stepped forward, helping Bella to her feet. She swayed slightly, her eyes fixed on the blackened cross still hanging above the door. "He remembered," she whispered. "God remembered." Outside, the endless snow had finally ceased. Bright morning light streamed through the skeletal rafters, warming the cold stones with promise of spring. Mrs. Willis crumpled to the chapel floor, her proud shoulders heaving with sobs. The soldiers who had restrained her stepped back, uncertain. In the heavy silence, Bella's soft footsteps echoed as she crossed the scorched boards. She knelt beside the weeping widow, reaching into her worn leather pack. The familiar cloth, her constant companion through months of hiding, felt soft between her fingers. With gentle hands, she draped the veil over Mrs. Willis's trembling ones. "Keep it," Bella said softly. "You need the covering more than I do." Around them, even the most hardened soldiers bowed their heads, moved by this simple act of mercy. The morning light caught tears on weathered cheeks beneath dusty cavalry hats. That evening, oil lamps cast warm circles in the chaplain's quarters. Steam rose from bowls of hearty stew as Bella and Adriel shared a quiet supper with the old priest. His eyes were bright, despite his pallor. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," the chaplain said, spreading his hands over their joined ones. "This mission needs good souls to tend it, to make it a place of healing again." Adriel met Bella's gaze across the table. She nodded, a smile touching her lips. "We'll rebuild come spring," Adriel said. "Every beam and board." "Then may God bless your work," the chaplain replied, "and the love that builds it." Dawn painted the sky in roses and gold as they rode out from Fort Bridger the next morning. Bella sat tall in her saddle, face lifted to the warming air. No veil shadowed her features, no shame weighted her shoulders. Beside her, Adriel guided his horse along the thawing trail, their path stretching free and clear before them. Weeks later, spring's warmth softened the mountain slopes. Crystal clear water rushed through the valleys, carrying winter's remnants downstream. Adriel and Bella crested the familiar ridge, their horses' hooves sinking into the wet earth near his old line shack. The snow had retreated like a tide, revealing patches of fresh grass around the weathered walls. Bella dismounted, her boots squelching in the mud as she surveyed the land. "The creek would be perfect," she said, pointing to where sunlight danced on flowing water. Together they worked from sunrise to sunset. Adriel's axe rang against fresh timber, while Bella cleared stones for a garden plot. They salvaged sturdy boards from the mission ruins, careful to honor the old chapel's remains. Each beam of their new cabin rose stronger and wider than Adriel's bachelor shack. Above their door, they mounted a wooden cross crafted from mission lumber. Bella traced the grain with gentle fingers. "A reminder," she whispered, "of where grace found us." Their evenings settled into peaceful rhythm. Lamplight warmed the cabin's fresh-cut walls as they shared simple suppers. Bella's hymns drifted through open windows, mixing with cricket song and evening breeze. The familiar words of Scripture bound them together as they read, heads bent close over worn pages. "We'll need extra blankets," Bella said one night, "for whoever God sends our way." Adriel nodded, a smile coming easier to his face these days. "Reckon we've got room enough to shelter any soul that needs it." That evening, thunder rolled soft and low across the peaks. They sat on their new porch, fingers intertwined, watching purple clouds gather. The air hung sweet with coming rain and fresh-cut wood. "Thank you, Lord," Bella prayed quietly, "for another day of mercy." Adriel squeezed her hand, adding his own silent gratitude for the gift of renewed purpose, and the woman who helped him find it. Summer crept into the valley like a gentle tide. The garden Bella had planted burst with life, rows of corn reaching skyward, peas climbing their stakes, and herbs perfuming the morning air. Purple wildflowers dotted the grass around the cabin's fresh-hewn walls. That Sunday morning dawned clear and bright. Wagons and horses appeared along the winding trail, bringing folks from scattered homesteads and camps. Children darted between the aspens while their parents gathered by the riverbank, drawn by word of the new chapel's first service. Bella stood at the small chapel door, greeting each arrival with a warm smile. Above the entry, the old veil, now washed pure white, rippled in the breeze like a banner of welcome. She had scrubbed it clean in the creek, transforming what was once her shield into a symbol of peace. Inside, rough-hewn benches filled quickly. Sunlight streamed through simple windows, catching dust motes that danced like golden snow. Adriel moved to the front, his weathered Bible in hand. Though he'd never thought to preach, the words came natural as breathing. "Grace don't hide," he said, his voice steady and clear. "It heals, like spring water washing winter away, like sunshine melting snow. I've seen it work miracles right here in these mountains." His eyes met Bella's, and in that glance passed all they'd weathered together. Fear turned to trust, shame to dignity, loneliness to love. After the service, they shared fresh bread and a hot coffee under the aspens. Children played tag between the trees, while adults swapped news and passed plates of biscuits. The air hummed with conversation and laughter, transforming the once silent ridge into a place of community. As evening painted the sky in amber and rose, folks began their journeys home. Bella stood on the porch, watching sunlight spill across the distant peaks. The mountains glowed like burnished copper, their snowcaps pink with alpine glow. Adriel stepped behind her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. The gesture felt as natural as breathing now, as right as prayer. "You're home now," he said softly. Bella smiled, her face open to the evening air. No veil, no shame, just grace unveiled at last. In that moment, watching day fade to dusk over their mountain sanctuary, she felt the full circle of God's mercy. What began in a blizzard had bloomed into belonging, and she was finally, truly free. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily. And the next might change your day.